Hi guys, this is for the seniors. Just go to Obama. I'm wearing your T-shirt right now. There you go, seniors. So I'm thinking about you as you're at home socially distancing. At least I hope that's what you're doing. All right, so today we're going to talk about in this video, continue talking about like life in the 1990s, particularly one area that I think a lot of people take for granted, but really should not be taken for granted. The unbelievable drop in crime that took place in the 1990s. I know all you guys were born after 2000. I guess you guys were born 2002. So if you grew up in New York City, you're fortunate enough to grow up in a very, very different city than I grew up, or certainly than your parents grew up in if they grew up in New York, where you constantly had to worry about crime. Crime was basically the scourge of urban life in the 1970s and 1980s. It was everywhere, and we talked about this a lot last semester. Crime was just a fact of life for almost every big city American. And when polls were done, opinion polls were done in the 1970s and 1980s, and people were asked what's the number one problem in the United States, consistently people said crime. And a lot of other things were going on then, right? The economy was up and down. We had a lot of foreign policy challenges and the like, but crime was consistently listed as the number one problem. But then in the 1990s, crime just began falling substantially. So today I want to talk about some theories about why that is. And whether it was, certain policies, whether it was just social phenomena, and why crime has stayed down since the 1990s. So it wasn't just something that was, that came and went, and then crime went back to the pre-1990s levels. It never did, which is a really, really big deal. So let's talk a little about that. Before we get to that, remember in our last video, we were talking about the religious right, and we were talking about the conservative Christians who were just very concerned about life in the 1990s. I'm okay, they're not. Remember that line that we used in our last video? The idea that just the culture was just, was just getting coarsened. We talked about TV and music and how that worried a lot of conservative people. Young Americans seemed as liberated as ever in the 1990s. Body piercing, tattooing was getting very popular in the 1990s among young people. And a lot of conservatives certainly didn't like that. Out of wedlock births, I even hate using that term, but like children born to parents who weren't married. 1 in 3 births by 1999 were to parents who were unmarried. There was greater cultural freedom. Only 60% of children lived with their 2 biological parents in the 1990s. So these were signs to a lot of conservative Christians and people who are cultural conservatives that things were just in decline in the United States. But there were so many positive numbers. The number of teenage girls who were having children dropped substantially in the 1990s from where it had been in the 70s and 80s. 50% of all law school graduates, medical school graduates, professional school graduates were women, which is a very, very positive social step. But conservatives felt that even though they were holding their own politically, remember the Republicans won control over Congress in the 1990s. They were really, there were a lot of Republican voters still out there, but they felt they were losing the cultural wars. But one thing that actually should have put people a little bit more who were concerned about that, should have put them more at ease, was the fact that crime was dropping so substantially in the 1990s, which was a monumental achievement. Drug abuse declined in the 1990s. Heroin was like the scourge of the 70s. Crack was the scourge of the 1980s. But drug use was going down in the 1990s, at least hard drug use. Welfare rolls began dropping. Less people were dependent on welfare. That was partly a result of some government policies, but not entirely. The economy was improving in the 1990s, so a lot of people were getting off welfare and getting into jobs. But let's talk now about crime. Crime was the menace of life in the 1970s and 1980s. But in the 1990s, we witnessed some very positive steps. Murder declined by significant numbers. At its peak in the 1990s in New York City, there were 7 people murdered every day in New York. It was like over 2,200 murders, I think, in 1991 or 1992, which are unbelievable numbers. But the murder rate began dropping substantially in the 1990s. Murder is usually seen as one of the best indicators of crime dropping or rising, because murder, by its very nature, has to be reported, right? Because they find the body, right? Other crimes cannot be reported, like, like robbery and, and sexual assaults and things of that nature. But murder is usually seen as the best indicator of whether crime is dropping or rising. Murder dropped substantially. Even property crime rates began dropping. We were actually below other industrialized nations, when we were always like above almost every industrialized nation in crime. So why did this happen? Why did crime drop so substantially in the 1990s? Well, people who are more on the more conservative end of things, but even not just conservatives, just a lot of people looking at this issue, credit different strategies used by policymakers. Now, Rudy Giuliani was elected mayor of New York City in 1993. Now, a lot of you guys just know Rudy Giuliani as, Trump's lawyer and the guy who got him impeached because of all that. It was his idea to actually hold up the Ukraine money, in return for Joe Biden, or at least to try to do that. Which was the reason why President Trump was impeached this year. So that's how most of you guys know about Giuliani. But for people my age and older, Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York City who was usually credited as the guy who tamed crime. Now, Giuliani came mayor in 1993. He was elected, and he implemented a new strategy for crime reduction. It was called, well, 2 things. One was CompStat, where basically they put the entire city on a computer and they said that where are the high crime areas? Let's flood those areas with police. So that was one policy of Giuliani's. The other policy implemented by the Giuliani administration in New York City was something called broken windows theory. Now, broken windows is enormously controversial, especially to people who are on the left politically. Now, the broken windows theory says that police have to go after quality of life crimes, turnstile jumping, graffiti, artists, people graffitiing public property, squeegee men. Now, you guys probably don't remember this, but back in the day when you were driving, it was almost impossible to avoid these guys who used to come and just start wiping your window, cleaning it, hoping that you would give them money. So this enraged New Yorkers. So Giuliani and his people said, we have to go after crime like this, because if you go after crime like this, bigger crime will drop. Now, the reason it's called broken windows is because they say, well, if you see a neighborhood or a building that has broken windows, then you're less likely to maintain that building and maintain that neighborhood. So worse things happen as a result of the windows being broken. So the theory with broken windows is that if you go after these relatively small quality of life crimes, then other crime will fall. So with the turnstile jumping, for instance, it wasn't just that, turnstile jumpers all are criminals, but everyone who was a criminal on the train jumped the turnstile. So if you go after these people, you actually go after crime in the subways, which was at horrendous levels in the 1970s and 1980s, subway crime. So go after the quality of life crimes, then more serious crimes will drop as a result. Now, this is very controversial. There are a lot of liberal criminologists who say this is totally the wrong way to go after crime, because you're basically throwing in jail potentially, low level or very low level offenders, and based on what, to what end? So this is enormously controversial. as we see, to this day with the debate over whether we should arrest people who jump turnstiles. But this theory was, for good or for ill, was implemented by the Giuliani administration, and crime began dropping. And a lot of people, including a lot of liberal New Yorkers, credited Giuliani's approach with actually reducing crime. Critics of Giuliani said it was actually, the crime drop was actually started earlier, before Giuliani got in, because there was a policy called community policing that had been in place before the Giuliani administration. In fact, Giuliani kind of rejected community policing, because he wanted to flood bad areas with cops. Now, community policing is the idea that, you should send cops to different neighborhoods in the city. That way people develop a relationship with the cops. They don't think of them as an occupying army, and they're more likely to trust the police. And when you trust the police, then the neighborhood trusts the police, then things will be safer. So some people say that was the reason why crime really began dropping. But there are a lot of theories. The population of young men began declining substantially in the 1990s. Remember, the baby boomers came of age, were teenagers and young adults in the 1970s and 1980s. So there are a lot less young men, in the 1990s. And of course, men between the ages of 14 to 24 are the ones most likely to commit crimes. No offense, guys. The economy was improving in the 1990s across the board. So that perhaps was a factor, right? The economy's better, less reason to turn to crime. Some people say that the reason why crime dropped is because finally we got tough on crime. That in the 1970s we were way too lax. We were letting people in and out of jail, or no jail at all, for serious offenses, letting people out on technicalities, or after they've only served a little bit of time in jail. So tougher criminal penalties were passed in the 1990s, particularly the 3 strikes law, where on your third felony conviction, you would actually get a life sentence in jail. The population of incarcerated people skyrocketed in the 1990s. Now, this is a very big issue today, because a lot of people say the mass incarceration of the this mass incarceration phenomena, which we still are experiencing, is a result of these tough on crime policies in the 1990s. But others argue that, well, we passed those tough on crime policies and crime really began going down. So it was worth it. The war on drugs continued with increasing numbers of Americans in prison. There was a 5-fold increase in the number of people in jail. By 1999, 2.1 million Americans were actually serving in prison, which is astronomical numbers. And this was the highest incarcerated population of any country in the world. I think even higher than communist China. So conservatives continued pushing this tough on crime approach, and it was actually supported by a lot of people who were not conservatives, because they felt we have to do something to actually reduce crime. And when people looked at the numbers from the 1990s, they were actually saying, well, it worked. Violent crime had gone up 25% from 1980 until 1992, and then when it began dropping. Now, the thing is, critics argue that this resulted in some really bad things. Mass incarceration, as we talked about. 28% of African American men at some point will be in the criminal justice system, and largely this is because of the drug wars, the war on drugs. And Rudy Giuliani became the public face of the drop in crime. But in New York City, but every major city except Baltimore, unfortunately, experienced a huge drop in crime in the 1990s. So it was real. It was real. The drop. I read a book, a student actually, recommend, because I just threw this question out there in a disco class a couple of years ago, like, what was the reason for this? And a student recommended a book to me, and I ordered it and I read it, and it basically said the drop in crime was largely the result of people taking control over their own neighborhoods. That people who lived in these poor, high crime areas, like in the South Bronx, for instance, the South Bronx kind of became the metaphor for high crime in the 1990s. People said enough was was enough. And people began cleaning up their buildings and really began, taking ownership of their neighborhoods. And this actually was the end of their community. And this was the real reason why crime dropped so much in the 1990s. I think one of the things we have to do is when we're looking at this, and I know this is hard, but when we're looking at the drop in crime, because I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure. And I've studied this issue like a lot, but I'm not entirely sure why crime dropped so much in the 1990s. I think it's important for us to take off our ideological lens. Whether we're liberal, whether we're conservative, whether we're moderate, and really try to look at this just analytically. What actually resulted in crime dropping? And that could actually mean some uneasy answers for both liberals and for conservatives. But I really think that that's really the way we should go when we try to look at this. Now, unfortunately, there were still a lot of alarmists who actually, said that crime will never go down, even if it's dropping a little bit now. Crime is actually going to continue going up. Hillary Clinton gave an infamous speech in 1996 where she said, "We've seen the rise of super predators, young people who have no conscience and will commit any crime and not care." And basically, Hillary said in this speech, we have to bring them to heel. Now, Hillary got into a lot of trouble for that speech 20 years later when she ran for president, asking her, what did she mean by that? With a lot of people saying it's a very racially loaded term, that super predator is referring to minority teenagers and bringing them to heel, which is like very fraught terminology. So crack baby, one of the reason for this belief at super predators, which was a term coined by a criminology professor, was that the crack babies, the babies born to crack addicted mothers, were going to turn out, with almost sociopathic, with no conscience. But that actually did not happen. This fear about the crack babies growing up to be criminals really didn't happen. In fact, modern research has actually shown that crack has less of an effect on developing babies than was previously believed. It's terrible for babies, but I mean, it was not as bad as people made out in the 1980s. It's hard, I know, to kind of go beyond our own ideology to try to look at this, but I think we have to. The crime bill of 1994 is now almost kind of seen as the test of whether you're really a progressive or not. Do you oppose the crime bill? Remember, President Clinton signed the crime bill, so people a lot of liberals didn't forgive Hillary for it. Joe Biden helped write the crime bill. Expect to hear a lot about that. We have heard a decent amount about that. But the crime bill of 1994, which a lot of people say ushered in this era of mass incarceration, was supported by liberals in the 1990s. It was actually seen as a liberal, or at least a fairly liberal piece of legislation, because it included funding for after-school programs for kids. It included an assault weapons ban, funding for the states and cities for more cops. So it was not seen as a conservative or racist piece of legislation. It received the support of most African-American members of Congress. The people who opposed the crime bill largely were conservatives who felt it was too soft. So I know that it's hard to think today because, the crime bill is now mentioned constantly as the example of reactionary legislation, which, we can think that today, but I think it's important to remember the context of why it was passed. People were just so, average Americans, a lot of minority Americans were just so fed up with the high crime rates that people were willing to try anything and willing to try a combination of harsh policies, like, 3 strikes and things like that, with some progressive legislation like midnight basketball programs for young people in order to deal with crime. But we can definitely say 20 years later that bill certainly did have unintended consequences in terms of creating the prison industrial complex, mandatory minimum sentences for people where you commit a crime, you have to serve X number of years in jail, which swelled up the jail population. So honestly, I know you've been watching this video. Hopefully you've been watching this video from beginning to end. I can't really give you an easy answer. But I think if anybody wants to explore this issue in more depth, I would encourage you to. But I think it's important to take off our ideological blinders, regardless of where we stand politically, to try to look at what was the cause of the drop. All right, guys. So thanks for listening. I will see you in the next video. Peace.